Welcome to Emavira Audiobooks channel. This is fiction crime stories playlist that get under your skin. Every story you hear on this channel is a work of fiction, written for the pure, unsettling pleasure of a story well told. Not a true crime report, not a documentary, just fiction, start to finish. Tonight's story takes us north to Iceland, to the fjords, the endless summer daylight, and one quiet corner of the capital where something very dark begins to unfold. This is Under the Midnight Sun, the Bakkavík Case, an Emavira fiction crime story. 23-year-old Christian Jarnason had wanted to be a fashion designer since he was old enough to hold a needle. He'd grown up in Saftrur, a fishing town tucked so deep into the fjords of the Westfjords that the sun disappeared behind the mountains for weeks at a time in winter, and from the time he was small, he used to say the darkness there taught him to notice color. At 19, he packed 2 suitcases and moved to Reykjavik to study design. He was quick-witted, warm, a little theatrical, and he made friends easily. His mother, Solveig, liked to tell people that the move had changed her son, that the boy who used to sit quietly at the edge of family gatherings had become someone who could walk into a room and light it up. Reykjavik was not cheap, and a student loan only stretched so far. Rent alone ate most of what he had left after tuition, and there were months he lived on little more than bread and the free coffee at his design school. Christian was openly gay, and sometime in his second year, he started taking the occasional paid date. Men with money to spare, usually older, met through apps and websites, mostly foreign businessmen or quiet locals who didn't want to be seen at the gay bars on Lagavegr.
He was careful about it.
He'd ask for a name, a photo, an address ahead of time, and he'd send all of it to his closest friend, Ellen, so that someone always knew exactly where he was. He liked to meet in public first, somewhere with people and light, before agreeing to go anywhere private. He carried a small pair of scissors in his coat pocket, just in case. It felt, most nights, like more than enough protection. Reykjavik was small, and small cities bred a certain kind of confidence, the sense that nothing truly terrible could happen somewhere everyone seemed, at least a little, to know everyone else. By early June, Christian was buried in final exams and running low on money. Late one night, he logged into an app called Nidal, where he sometimes advertised, and found a message from a user calling himself Loki. Loki offered an unusually generous sum for a single overnight visit, far more than Christian normally charged, and offered without any haggling at all. Christian hesitated. When he asked why the rate was so high, Loki explained that he was house-sitting for a friend who was abroad for the summer and could afford to be generous. Satisfied, Christian asked for a photo and an address, both of which came back within minutes. They agreed to meet outside the Bakkavík bus terminal, a working-class corner on the eastern edge of the capital, on a Tuesday evening in the middle of June. Before he left his flat that night, Christian sent Ellen all the details. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added a second message. "In case I get killed." He meant it as a joke. Ellen read it and laughed and told him to text her when he got home. He never did. Just before dawn that Thursday, an emergency call came through requesting an ambulance on Melgata, a narrow residential street of low apartment blocks in Bakkavík. "There's a young guy lying out here," the caller reported. "Seems like he's gone down, could be a seizure, or maybe he's just had too much to drink. I really can't say." Asked for a number to call back, the man mumbled something about needing to get to his car and hung up. When paramedics reached Melgata, they found no one. Dispatch traced the call and rang back. "Oh, I've already driven off," the man told them, claiming he'd only caught sight of the person for a second from behind the wheel and figured he couldn't have been more than 20. It wasn't until nearly 6 that morning that paramedics finally found him. A young man slumped against a low garden wall outside a block of flats, shirt rucked up as if he'd been dragged there, skin already cold. He'd been dead for hours. His name was Christian Jarnason, He had his wallet, a transit card, some prescription medication, and a small brown bottle with a trace of white powder inside. No phone. His jeans were undone. There was a faint mark on his chest that, at first glance, looked almost like the print of a shoe. The lead officers traced the 999 caller to a 39-year-old man named Kari Orvaldsson, who, it turned out, lived in the very building outside which Christian had been found. No one answered the door when they knocked. A medical examiner estimated Christian had been dead 6 to 12 hours by the time he was found, and waved off the mark on his chest as lividity, a normal effect of blood settling after death. But the crime scene manager wasn't so sure. The spot where he'd been left wasn't the kind of place anyone would simply sit down. His underwear was on backwards. His t-shirt was several sizes too big. She ordered a full post-mortem, unwilling to rule out someone else's hand in it. When police finally got into the building, they found Kari asleep in his bed. He said he'd come home from a night shift around 3 in the morning and found a young man collapsed by the entrance. He'd slapped him to try to wake him, dragged him by the arms to prop him against the wall, called for an ambulance, and gone to sleep. It was a strange story. The paramedics had put time of death hours before that, but for now, nothing pointed to murder. Talking to Christian's friends, police learned about his escort work and about a date he'd mentioned going to in Bakkavík with a client calling himself Loki. Ellen told them Christian had shown her a photo, shown a picture of Kari Orvaldsson instead. She said she was almost certain it was the same man. Christian's mother Solveig had been traveling abroad, phone off, and didn't learn her son was dead until 3 days later. She flew home in a fog of disbelief. The idea that Christian had died of a drug overdose made no sense to her at all. He was careful, he was safety conscious, and he never went anywhere without his phone, which was nowhere to be found. She begged police to trace it. She was told that would be expensive and perhaps unnecessary. A background check did turn something up, though not on the phone but on Kari himself. Months earlier, a young man calling himself Dager, not his real name, had reported that Kari, his on-and-off boyfriend, had gotten him drunk and given him something that left him barely conscious before assaulting him. Dager withdrew the complaint days later, too frightened to press it further. No charges had followed. A week after Christian's body was found, police arrested Kari for lying to them. After 2 false stories, he finally admitted he'd invited Christian over for paid sex, that the 2 of them had slept well into the following afternoon, and that he'd then headed off to work, leaving Christian alone in the flat. He claimed he came home to find him unconscious but breathing, panicked, dressed the body, and dragged him outside before calling for help, because, he said, leaving him inside would have looked suspicious. Police charged him with obstructing an investigation. Christian's actual cause of death remained, officially, unexplained. Kari was released on bail. Months later, toxicology results confirmed it. Christian Jarnason had died of a fatal overdose of GHB, a fast-acting depressant with barely any margin between a party dose and a lethal one, especially mixed with alcohol, which, in his case, it had been. 10 weeks after Christian died, a woman named Asta Kristinsdottir was walking her dog through the old churchyard at the edge of Bakkavík, a quiet green space she loved for its stillness, ringed by a low stone wall. As she came around the back of the church, something looked wrong. A young man sat propped against the wall, legs stretched in front of him, sunglasses askew. At first, she thought he'd had too much to drink and was sleeping it off, except she'd walked that same path the evening before, and there had been no one there. She stepped closer, touched his hand. It was cold. Paramedics confirmed he was dead. Beside him were 2 bags, toiletries, medication, paperwork, an empty vodka bottle, and identification for a 25-year-old Polish national named Marek Nowak. Nothing appeared to be missing, which told police this likely wasn't a robbery. They logged the death as unexplained but not suspicious, and began working through the paperwork in his bag. Marek had only been in the country a matter of weeks. The one address they could trace led to a flat across the city, where a young Icelandic man named Orstein Halldórsson, Steiny to his friends, was working from home when police told him a man named Marek Nowak had been found dead in a churchyard in Bakkavík. Steiny was floored. He'd met Marek through a mutual friend online only weeks earlier, and knowing Marek was still finding his footing in a new country, had told him he could crash in the spare room for as long as he needed. What was meant to be 2 weeks turned into 6. They got on well. Evenings at the pub, films on the sofa. Marek was sharp and warm, fresh out of university, fluent in English already and picking up Icelandic fast, with hopes of eventually working as an interpreter. Steiny had helped him open a bank account, so he could take a retail job in the meantime. But Steiny's flat was small and mid-renovation, and eventually Marek started looking for his own place. One day in August, out of nowhere, he announced he'd found somewhere in Bakkavík and would move the next day. Steiny didn't push. They had a farewell drink, and Marek moved out with an open invitation to come back if things didn't work out. A few days later, Steiny texted to see how the new place was treating him. Nothing came back. Unsettled, Steiny texted the unfamiliar number Marek had last messaged him from and asked whoever it belonged to call him back. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Kolbjörn, who explained he'd known Marek for a couple of years and had dropped him off near a part of town called Fossvik, so he could continue on to his new flat. When Steiny told him Marek was dead, Kolbjörn sounded genuinely shaken. For days afterward, Steiny found himself replaying the last ordinary conversation they'd had, Marek joking about how he'd finally learned to pronounce the town's name properly, both of them laughing about it over coffee. It didn't feel real that someone who had been so full of plans, so certain his life in Iceland was only just beginning, could simply be gone, filed away by strangers as one more sad, unremarkable statistic. Weeks later, a message reached Marek's social media page from a user calling himself Bjorn Eilifsson. According to his profile, a man in his 40s originally from Denmark, now settled a town over from Bakkavík. Marek's ex-boyfriend Tomasz, back in Poland, saw the message and wrote to tell him Marek had died. "Oh no. I'm so sorry," Bjorn replied. He was a genuinely lovely guy. He told Tomasz he was the person Marek had gone to stay with after leaving Steiny's flat, that they'd got along, even slept together once, but that Marek had spent a lot of time on a hookup app called Pulse Point, chatting to an older man who went by Loki. Loki, he said, had been strangely eager for Marek to come and stay with him, even offering money. One morning, Bjorn claimed Loki had turned up at his door, and within minutes was loading Marek's things into a car. They'd driven off together. That was the last Bjorn claimed to have seen of him. Steiny passed all of this along to Marek's post-mortem findings, which came back a short time later, a fatal dose of GHB mixed with alcohol and a trace of another stimulant. Bakkavík had its share of drug problems, and to the officers involved, a young foreign national with no fixed local ties looked, sadly, like a familiar story. They saw no reason to dig further. Unconvinced, Steiny spent an evening searching online for other unexplained deaths in Bakkavík. One article, only months old, stopped him cold. Nearly a year later, an inquest opened into the death of a 23-year-old chef named Aaron Jornsson. Weeks after Marek's death, another body had been found propped in the exact same position, against the exact same churchyard wall, a young man with short dark hair, a blue bedsheet draped over him, cold to the touch. On his chest sat a plastic sleeve with a handwritten note inside. "To everyone, especially my family, I can't keep going anymore. I'm the reason Marek is dead. It happened at a friend's flat, nothing planned, and I gave him more G than he could handle. I didn't realize something was wrong until he'd stopped breathing, and by then it was too late. None of it was on purpose, but the guilt is mine, and no one at home even knew I'd gone out that night. If I go to the police, I lose everything, and I won't put my family through that. This way, at least Merrick and I are together again. I hope he can forgive me. As for the man I was with last night, leave him out of it. He was gone before any of this and knows nothing. I've taken what was left of the G, with some sleeping pills. Everything's going fuzzy. I'm sorry to everyone. All my love, Aaron. Aaron's father, Bjorn Kjartansson, had raised him mostly alone, and the two were unusually close. Aaron had a long-term boyfriend, a stable job at a countryside spa hotel, and, as far as his family knew, no history of drug use and no connection whatsoever to Bakkavík. Only days before his death, the family had gathered for a birthday dinner, and Aaron had been entirely himself, teasing his father about his cooking, talking about a trip he and his boyfriend were planning for the following summer. There had been no sign of anything wrong, no warning, nothing that in hindsight anyone could point to. The idea that he'd taken his own life made no sense to any of them. Police didn't show the family the full note at first, only the closing lines, asking if they recognized the handwriting. They couldn't be sure. It was a small, blurry scan, and nearly all their contact with Aaron in recent years had been by text. Officers promised a handwriting expert would compare it to old birthday cards. Toxicology, once it came back, confirmed the method. At least, like Merrick before him, Aaron had died of a GHB overdose. When Aaron's father and stepmother, Halla, were finally shown the letter in full, it read as strangely cold. Nothing like Aaron's voice, no family member mentioned by name. One line that struck them as simply bizarre. No one at home even knew I'd gone out that night. Aaron hadn't lived under their roof in years. Why write that at all? And who was the man mentioned? The one the note begged them not to blame. The police reassured the family that drugs could distort a person's voice on paper, and that the mystery man was likely untraceable. At the inquest, it emerged that the promised handwriting analysis had never actually taken place. Officers had simply compared the note informally to Aaron's old diary. It also came out for the first time that the blue bedsheet found with his body had never been tested for DNA, and the bottle in his pocket never checked for fingerprints, because investigators hadn't believed anyone else was involved. The coroner, visibly unhappy, recorded an open verdict, unable to rule out a third party, though that finding placed no obligation on police to reopen anything. 2 months later, on a Monday evening, the family of 25-year-old Baldur Olafsson began to worry. Baldur worked forklift shifts at a warehouse and lived with his parents in Vamsnes, a quiet suburb just outside the capital. He'd gone out with friends the Saturday before, come home around 1 a.m, chatted briefly with his father, and gone to bed, or so everyone assumed. When his parents woke the next day, he was gone, and he missed the family's usual Sunday lunch. By Monday afternoon, with still no word, the worry had turned sharp. Baldur was the kind of person who always let someone know where he was. Going silent this long was entirely out of character. As his mother phoned one of his sisters to ask if she'd heard anything, the police knocked on the door. Hours earlier, a groundskeeper walking the churchyard at Bakkavík had found his body propped against a wall, on the far side of the very same wall where Merrick and Aaron had been found the year before. Baldur's sisters, Sigrun and Katrin, didn't believe a word of the official story. Baldur was the youngest of the three, but he'd always looked out for his sisters like an older brother, funny, steady, the glue of the family, the one who remembered everyone's birthday and always drove home from parties, so no one else had to. He had zero interest in drugs, and his job subjected him to routine testing he'd always passed clean. He was, if anything, almost fastidious, the kind of person who ironed his work clothes the night before a shift and kept his boots lined up by the door. The autopsy did turn up a needle mark, but in his right arm, the same side he favored, backwards from what anyone would expect if he'd injected himself. His wallet, always kept in his right pocket, was found in his left. And he never went anywhere without his phone. Nearly 2 weeks passed with no update. When the sisters finally pushed for answers, they learned the investigation had quietly stalled. Digging on their own late into the night, they discovered that 2 other young men had died in that same churchyard the year before, on the opposite side of that same wall. When they brought this to police and asked if the deaths could be connected, the answer was a flat no. Undeterred, they kept pushing until officers finally agreed to walk them out to the exact spot where Baldur had been found. Standing there, knowing how careful and particular Baldur was, the sisters were more certain than ever he'd never have wandered into a place like that alone. The sisters didn't believe it. They pushed for the footage to be reviewed again. Eventually, police relented, and on closer inspection, realized the sisters had been right all along. The man walking alone toward the churchyard wasn't Baldur at all. The 2 men had never actually split up on camera. Preliminary toxicology soon confirmed Baldur, too, had died of a GHB overdose. His sisters were sure the man on the CCTV was responsible, but seeing the footage themselves, they couldn't identify him. Police were reluctant to release the image publicly, but eventually agreed. About a month later, an officer had the footage open on a monitor when a detective walking past happened to glance at the screen and felt a chill run through him. He recognized the man instantly. He'd worked Christian Jarnison's case. It was Carrie Orvaldson. The moment Carrie was tied to that footage, everything changed. The detectives who'd separately handled all 4 deaths were pulled into an urgent joint meeting. Laid side by side, the files told an unmistakable story. By the end of that meeting, no one in the room doubted they were looking at a serial killer. Carrie's own account already placed Christian's death inside his flat. CCTV placed him as the last person seen with Baldur. Nothing yet tied him directly to Merrick or Aaron, but with both bodies found meters from where Baldur turned up, and all 4 dead from the same drug, investigators had little doubt he was behind all of it. Brought in for questioning, Carrie admitted Merrick had stayed with him for a couple of days after they'd met online, and that he'd taken him to a party, the last he claimed to have seen of him. He denied giving Merrick any drugs, blaming an unnamed man at the party instead. Told that 3 of the 4 victims had been found propped against the same churchyard wall, he visibly stiffened, insisting he hadn't known that. Shown a photo of Baldur, he claimed not to recognize him at all. "I had no idea," he said. "Definitely not." Unconvinced, police arrested him on suspicion of 4 counts of murder, launching a full investigation, Operation Notfari, named, with a grim irony no one in the unit missed, after the legendary first man said to have settled alone in Iceland's wilderness centuries ago. Specialist detectives began tearing through Carrie's phone and computer records, and what they found painted a harrowing picture. Christian, they now believed, had been his first victim. Days before they met, Carrie had mentioned to a friend, almost casually, that his last hookup had been heavily dosed on GHB. That same day, he'd spent hours searching online for content about incapacitation and non-consensual sex. That night, using the alias Loki, he'd messaged 8 different escorts, Christian among them. Bank records showed he never had anywhere near enough money to cover the fee he'd offered. He'd never intended to pay it at all. The investigation's first real failure came into focus here. The original medical examiner had estimated Christian dead 6 to 12 hours before he was found, directly contradicting Carrie's claim of discovering him alive that morning. That detail had simply never reached the detective on the case. There was worse. Iceland's police kept 2 separate records, one for formal charges, one for softer intelligence, allegations that never led to prosecution. A check of the first, after Christian's death, turned up Dager's earlier complaint. But no one ever re-interviewed Dager, and a fuller check of the second system, never run, would have shown he wasn't the only one. Weeks before Christian died, transport officers had responded to a call about a young man collapsing near the bus terminal, sick and disoriented, with Carrie going through his bag. The young man, called Egil here, not his real name, later said Carrie had given him something that knocked him out cold, and that he'd woken naked with no memory of what happened. He kept it from the authorities entirely, terrified word would somehow reach his mother and father, but the report still made it into the system. No one ever cross-checked it against Carrie's name. Even after charging him over the lies about Christian, no one dug further into how he'd actually died. His computer wasn't properly examined until months later, and even then, the report barely scratched the surface. It was a foundational rule of death investigation, one every recruit learned in their first year, that an unexplained death should be treated as a possible homicide until the evidence said otherwise. Somewhere along the way, in a small country and used to this kind of violence, that rule had simply been forgotten. A thorough search at the time, investigators later argued, could have exposed everything and saved 3 lives. Had anyone looked harder at Merrick instead of writing him off as a vulnerable outsider, they'd have found that he'd texted a friend a location pin for Carrie's own address days before he died, along with photos of the flat. Carrie had even introduced him to a neighbor, Finner, as his new Polish flatmate. When Merrick stopped replying to anyone, Carrie told Finner he'd gone off with some soldier he met online. Later, after Marek's body had already been found, Carrie texted Finner again, feigning concern, then eventually claimed Merrick had gone home to Poland and picked up a mysterious illness. Investigators also confirmed that the Bjorn Eilifsen account used to mislead Marek's ex-boyfriend belonged to Carrie all along, the exact information Steiny had tried, and failed, to get anyone to take seriously. A week after Marek's death, Carrie had begun chatting with Aaron Jornsen on a dating site, inviting him for dinner with a joke about proving he wasn't some psycho. They met one afternoon in early September. Aaron told his boyfriend he'd be home late. It was the last anyone heard from him. The next morning, Carrie deleted the account he'd used to contact him. A handwriting expert later confirmed, beyond doubt, that Carrie had written the note found on Aaron's body himself, inventing an entire fictional connection between Aaron and Merrick purely to send investigators chasing a ghost. It worked. Local police never once considered a link between Aaron and any other man in the area, despite the note's own plea not to blame, the guy I was with last night. Months after Aaron's death, Carrie pleaded guilty to obstructing the investigation into Christian's death, served a short prison sentence, and was released early. He was back on the apps within weeks. Within months, he'd met Baldur Olafsson. Digital records showed the two of them agreeing to meet at the Bakkavík bus terminal in the small hours of a Sunday morning. CCTV tracked them walking together toward Melgata before vanishing from camera range, the last confirmed sighting of Baldur alive. The next morning, Carrie blocked Baldur's account, erasing their messages, then deleted the app entirely and texted his own flatmate to stay away from the flat that day. Investigators believed he'd killed Baldur shortly after they arrived, kept the body in his flat through the day, then carried it to the churchyard that night, planting drugs and a lighter in his pockets to fake a solitary overdose, and disposing of his phone, exactly as he had with the others, to erase every trace of contact. Carrie Orvaldsson was charged with the murders of Christian Jarnason, Merrick Nowak, Aaron Jornsen, and Baldur Olafsson. But investigators were certain there were more victims still unidentified. On his phone, they found homemade recordings, several showing him with young men who appeared to be unconscious. Detectives partnered with LGBTQ+ organizations and appealed publicly for survivors to come forward. A man we're calling Jarkey here, a stand-in, not his actual name, still thought often about a night years back when he was 19. Everything about that evening had started ordinarily enough. Carey had seemed friendly, easy to talk to, the kind of older guy who made you feel interesting. He'd gone to Carey's flat, been given a glass of wine, and noticed a gritty residue at the bottom of the glass only after it was too late. The room tilting, his thoughts turning to fog, before he was raped while barely conscious. He never reported it. For years afterward, he told himself he must have simply had too much to drink, that it had somehow been his own fault. A story he only stopped believing when he saw Carey's face on the news. Another man described being shown, the following day, a recording of an assault he had no memory of living through. A third, a man called Fanner here, had gone to Carey's flat for consensual, drug-free sex, only to feel a burning numbness the moment Carey applied what he'd called lubricant with a syringe. Others described nearly identical experiences, one losing consciousness entirely, another managing to leave just in time. Dager, the ex who'd first reported him years earlier, came forward again, describing an almost identical assault under the same pretense. Text messages recovered from Carey's phone, exchanged with a former long-term partner, showed him discussing, almost clinically, how he'd found new ways to administer the drug more quickly, more quietly, with less chance of anyone noticing beforehand. Together with his search history, hour after hour of searches for incapacitation, sedation, non-consensual content, going back years, the pattern was impossible to miss. He had, investigators concluded, spent years dosing men into unconsciousness purely, so he could violate them without any resistance, fully aware, especially after Christian died, of exactly how dangerous that was. He had simply kept going anyway. What stung most for the families, once all of this came out, was how quickly Operation Not Fari had pieced it together, a stark contrast to how little the original investigators had done. Christian's mother had begged them to trace his phone. Merrick had been written off as a transient nobody would miss. Aaron's staged note had been taken almost entirely at face value, with no one bothering to check whether he and Merrick had ever actually met. They hadn't. Phone records placed Aaron at a pub with friends the very night Merrick was believed to have died. At Aaron's inquest, police had even told the coroner they'd tried and failed to trace the man in the note. That, investigators later confirmed, was simply untrue. No such attempt had ever been made. The bedsheet never tested for DNA. The bottle never checked for prints. Carey's own DNA, sitting in the database the entire time, would have flagged an immediate match. To the four families, it started to look like more than carelessness. They came to believe that assumptions about who these young men were, vulnerable, transient, promiscuous, had made it easy for investigators to close the file without really looking. A well-known LGBTQ+ rights advocate named Raffen Sigerson said publicly that it was indefensible for 4 deaths to be logged as merely unusual, not suspicious, and that a public warning should have gone out after the first 2 killings, not a full year later. 2 of these young men, he said, would likely still be with us. Carey Orvaldson's trial opened that October, where the 42-year-old faced charges including all 4 murders, alongside numerous counts of rape and administering drugs to incapacitate. He pleaded not guilty across the board, insisting every encounter had been consensual and every drug voluntary. On the stand, he tried to pin Marek's death entirely on Aaron, claiming the two had met at a party, gone off together, and that Aaron had confessed the overdose to him weeks later, distraught and begging for help. Prosecutors pointed out that phone records placed Aaron at a pub with friends that very night. How could he be in 2 places at once? "I don't know," Carey said. "That's just how I remember it." Confronted with the handwriting evidence proving he'd written the note himself, he eventually admitted it, claiming he'd only done so at Aaron's request. Having originally denied ever meeting Baldur at all, he now admitted inviting him over, insisting Baldur had drugged himself and that Carrie had simply left him there, alive. Several of his surviving victims took the stand. Dager told the court he sometimes felt he could have stopped everything that followed if he'd pushed harder years earlier. After 7 long weeks in which the 4 families sat together in the public gallery every single day, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 4 murder charges. In the gallery, no one moved for a moment. Then someone began to cry, and within seconds the sound had spread through the whole row. Relief and grief tangled together in a way none of them could quite separate. Sentencing him to life, the judge called the fabricated stories about Aaron and Merrick cruel, calculated lies that had caused immeasurable pain to Aaron's family, and said that whatever Carrie's original intentions, he must have understood the mortal risk he was taking, especially after Christian's death, and had simply kept defending anyway. "You've been convicted of the murder of 4 young men," the judge said, "each killed in pursuit of your desire to violate them while unconscious by drugs you administered without their knowledge. The gravity of this offending is so exceptional that the maximum term is not just justified, it is required. You will die in prison." Outside the courthouse, Baldur's sister Katrin faced the cameras. "Justice has finally come for Baldur and the others he took from us," she said. "This man won't get the chance to tear apart another family." The conviction was a relief, but the weight of evidence against Carrie raised hard, painful questions about how police had missed the connections for so long. An independent oversight body reviewed the handling of the case and found systemic failings across the force, though ultimately no individual officer was found to have breached professional standards. Years later, fresh inquests were ordered into all 4 deaths, running for weeks with the missed opportunities laid out in exhaustive, often unbearable detail. The jury found all 4 men unlawfully killed, and that fundamental failures had allowed Carrie to keep killing for well over a year. In their joint statement afterward, the families didn't mince words. "These investigative failures should stand on the record as one of the most serious institutional failures in living memory," they wrote. Had the police done their job properly from the outset, Merrick, Aaron, and Baldur would still be alive. They went further, saying plainly that they believed prejudice had shaped how the case had been handled from the very beginning, that 4 young gay men, some of them outsiders, some of them sex workers, had simply not been seen as worth the effort a different kind of victim might have received. Rafn Sigurdsson, the campaigner, called the police response incompetent, negligent, and shaped by exactly that kind of prejudice, adding that every person who'd tried to raise the alarm, Steini, Christian's mother, Baldur's sisters, had been dismissed and treated with something close to contempt. Solveig, Christian's mother, later said simply, "If my son had been a girl left outside like that, I believe they would have tried harder. Because he was a young gay man, they just didn't." Baldur's sisters agreed, saying they believed the police were nearly as culpable as Carrie himself. Aaron's stepmother Halla put it another way, "I can't put into words how failed I feel by an institution that's supposed to protect people. I just can't." Beneath all of it, though, underneath every hearing and every hard question, was something much simpler. For families who had lost young men with their whole lives still ahead of them, a designer who never got to see his name on a label, an interpreter who never got to use the language he'd only just begun to learn, a chef who never got to marry the man he loved, a brother who never got to walk anyone else home. That was Under the Midnight Sun, the Bakkavík Case, an Emavira fiction crime story. Thank you for spending this time with Emavira Audiobooks channel.